The title is the topic. Today I'm going to review Anita's first video, Damsel in Distress Part 1. A few things I'd like to cover before my review begins. First, about Peach. I want to defend the way Princess Peach has been treated, so let me set up my arguments. You mentioned games that she plays in.
Peach does of course appear in many spin-offs
that fall outside the core series.
However, all of these spin-offs fall well outside of the core Super Mario series of platformers.
Are you excluding these games from discussion with that statement? I can think of no other reason to say that since you don't go in depth about those games and focus on the core franchise. Then you mentioned she is the star of one adventure.
She is the star of only one adventure, and we'll get to that a little later.
Doesn't this fall outside the criteria of the other games you excluded? You specify outside the core series, yet Super Princess Peach also falls outside that criteria.
However, all of these spin-offs fall well outside of the core Super Mario series of platformers.
Let's look at the parallels using Smash Bros. She's not the star of these games. She's playable in Super Princess Peach and in Smash Bros. These games are both part of a core series of games. Neither of these games are part of the core Mario series. I'd say Smash Bros. Falls somewhere in the middle of these two. The only difference I can see is Princess Peach is the star over here.
She is the star of only one adventure.
Why is being the star of an adventure the only criteria for choosing that game to talk about? Being that you choose a game outside the core series, I choose any game outside the core series to defend Peach. On top of that, you also describe her portrayal in Super Princess Peach.
But don't get too excited, because everything else about the game ends up in a train wreck of gendered stereotypes. That's right, Peach's powers are her out-of-control, frantic female emotions.
A damsel in one game and unfairly portrayed in another. Since you are talking about her portrayal as a character across two series of games, I will also use that criteria to cross into as many games as I please. After all, are you not talking about the portrayal of the character herself once you cross outside the core series?
Studied extensively.
Now one could argue Anita is alluding to Super Princess Peach in Part 1, but doesn't actually talk about that game till Part 3, which brings me to my next point. You mentioned that Part 1 explored the history of the damsel in distress for games in the 80s and early 90s.
In our previous episode, we explored the history of the damsel in distress and how the trope became so pervasive in classic-era games from the 80s and early 90s.
Yet you begin your first video by talking about a Star Fox game that didn't exist till the 2000s.
Let's start with the story of a game that no one ever got to play.
How does this game have any bearing on the history of the 80s and 90s? You also reference several other games that are not from the 80s and 90s.
The core Super Mario Bros. 4-player options like the new more than a dozen games spanning a cut, with Pauline being with.
Why are these games even in this video?
Studied extensively.
What would a history book look like if you wrote it? Would you include discussions about Vietnam when it's a history book about World War II? Would you start talking about Napoleon Bonaparte and Waterloo in a book about the First Gulf War?
Studied extensively.
You bounce all over video game history from the early days to the present. Since that is what you are doing in a video about the history of the trope, I'll bounce in and out of any of your damsel videos as I seem fit, no matter the order. One line did catch my attention.
Okay, so we've established that the damsel in distress trope is one of the most widely used gendered cliches in the history of video games.
Then you mentioned you'll be talking about more modern games in relation to the damsel trope.
But what about more modern games? Has anything changed in the past 10 years?
So let's jump to video 3.
Over the past several years, we've seen an explosion of independent development.
So you say there is an explosion of independent development.
But have games produced outside of the mainstream studio system managed to break the gender mold and avoid damseling?
They don't have to follow the standard formulas since they aren't bound by mainstream studios.
But the widespread resurrection of old-school style damsels in distress.
Then you mention they follow it anyways. One could argue if they do whatever they want outside the mainstream studios, it is a good thing. You did mention widely used and widespread issues in both Part 1 and Part 3 respectively.
Okay, so we've established that the damsel in distress trope is one of the most widely used gendered cliches in the history of video games. But the widespread resurrection of old school style damsels in distress,
and it is more popular than ever.
the trope now appears to be more popular than ever.
Let's examine this a little further. In your third video, you talk about playable female characters, 6 games in total.
Super Princess Peach, Balloon Kid, Kaya Dark Lineage, Primal, Beyond Good and Evil, Aquaria.
One of which you say is one of your favorite games of all time.
In one of my favorite games of all time, Beyond Good and Evil,
You also point to another game,
Spelunky.
where a remake allows for a changeable damsel.
The 2012 HD remake of the game for Xbox Live again features the stock character damsel. This time an option was added to the menu that allows players to select a replacement for the default woman in peril.
You mention options to play a woman instead of a man.
Incidentally, a few games might have the option to play as a woman in multi-character lineups. A handful of other games attempt to get away with reproducing the damsel in distress by offering the ability to unlock and play as the damsel character.
You mention that games already exist that don't use the damsel trend.
Because it's absolutely possible to create indie games that appeal to the retro feeling of the 8-bit or 16-bit era without regurgitating the helpless woman as plot device.
Even giving us the names of some of these games.
Where's My Heart and Thomas Was Alone, games like Sword and Sorcery, Where's My Heart, and Fez are all beautiful and creative retro-style games without replicating or falling back on the damsel in distress.
And then mention games that mock the whole damsel trope.
She already has a plan to escape and he ruins it with his attempt to rescue her. It eventually becomes clear that the damsel has actually been trying to get away from the protagonist the whole time.
Not to mention, people who really desire to see role reversals can take it upon themselves if they wish.
Mike Micah's Donkey Kong hack, Mike Hoy's gender-bending version of Wind Waker, and Kenna Warzinski's Zelda starring Zelda.
Which means people already have the option to change the games themselves if they aren't pleased with the original concept.
This practice of gender hacking game ROMs has actually been around for decades.
For decades they've been doing it? As in since the start of gaming, which is now decades old?
And thanks to the internet, game mods and emulators are now much more widely accessible.
And more widely accessible than ever before, meaning that there are even less limitations and restrictions for gamers to take the power into their own hand if they want a change.
Yet, here we are, still seeing the same old cliche trotted out again and again.
Yet you cite plenty of games that don't have the trope, make fun of it, challenge it, or outright ignore it, again and again.
It's long past time to disrupt the established pattern, break the cycle, and create new gender paradigms.
You say that, despite the fact every example I pointed out already falls within the confines of that statement, within the same video. Part of refuting your arguments is to cite examples challenging your claims. I don't even have to leave your own body of work to begin building a case against you.
Studied extensively.
A large part of Damsel in Distress Part 3 is a counter-argument to your whole premise that this is an issue to begin with.
Widely used gendered cliches in the history of video games. But the widespread resurrection of old-school style damsels in distress.
How did you manage to make 2 videos explaining the issue, only to follow it up with a video that is in large part a rebuttal to your own arguments?
Studied extensively.
You can't properly structure your videos, you have bizarre rules for what you do and don't talk about, and your third video is in large part a rebuttal to the damsel in distress even being an issue. If your research wasn't so lazy, you would have thought this through ahead of time.
Studied extensively.
That's all for my opening. Now on to the review.
So, without further ado, let's jump right into the damsel in distress.
I agree full-heartedly. First thing was how you started with Dinosaur Planet.
Let's start with the story of a game that no one ever got to play, called Dinosaur Planet.
As per my original statement, why is this game here?
In our previous episode, we explored the history of the damsel in distress and how the trope became so pervasive in classic-era games from the 80s and early 90s.
Yet this is from the 2000s. Also, you explain how horrible this character was treated.
They rewrote and redesigned the game and released it as Star Fox Adventures for the GameCube in 2002.
Dinosaur Planet comes across as prefacing your whole premise with a big hitter to make the rest of your video have more impact than it actually does. Did any of the other games in this video have such drastic overhauls? I can see no other reason for leading in with Dinosaur Planet since it didn't come from the 80s or 90s.
And how the trope became so pervasive in classic era games from the 80s and early 90s.
Since it's just an observation, I'll let my audience decide if that was your intent. I noticed you mentioned this.
Princess Peach is in many ways the quintessential stock character version of the damsel in distress.
I'll remember that line for later. But on to something else you mentioned. You talk about other spin-offs.
Peach does of course appear in many spin-offs,
and that they fall outside the core series.
However, all of these spin-offs fall well outside of the core Super Mario series of platformers.
But you mentioned Mario was based off another character from another series.
And Jumpman became a certain very famous plumber.
If you are talking about Mario, who you chained all the way back to being based off of a Donkey Kong game, why did you stop the chain at games where Peach went from being a damsel to a playable character? Let's hear all the complaints you have about Peach.
The ill-fated princess, and she's kidnapped in 13 of them. Peach is kinda accidentally playable in this one. Sadly, Peach has never been a playable character again in the main franchise. The princess is still excluded from the action. Force her back into the damsel role again and again. And Princess Peach's role is essentially that of the ball. The two men are tossing her back and forth over the course of the main series, each trying to keep and take possession of the damsel ball.
Then you mentioned games she does appear in without any of those issues.
Peach does of course appear in many spin-offs such as the Mario Party, Mario Sports, and Mario Kart series.
Yet they fall outside the core series.
However, all of these spin-offs fall well outside of the core Super Mario series of platformers.
Why does it matter if they fall outside the core series? If you have so many complaints, why are you excluding these games from discussion? Is it because all of these games challenge any claims about the treatment of Peach as a character? You also mentioned in 2012 you were making this video.
This new video series will primarily focus on tracking 5 stereotypical representations of women. I'm going to look at the damsel in distress.
Cherry picking. When only select evidence is presented in order to persuade the audience to accept a position, and evidence that would go against the position is withheld. The stronger the withheld evidence, the more fallacious the argument.
However, all of these spin-offs fall well outside of the core Super Mario series of platformers.
You include the core series where she is a damsel, and Super Princess Peach where you have issues with her portrayal. But all the other games fall outside the core franchise, where Peach is not a damsel. Did you cherry-pick games when it comes to the treatment of Peach as a character?
However, all of these spin-offs fall well outside of the core Super Mario series of platformers.
With Anita's habit of chaining games till it no longer supports her argument, I'll deem it the cherry chain clip. Chain the data till it no longer supports your conclusions, then cut off the rest.
Studied extensively.
Now let's examine some of these claims individually with all the games in front of us.
The ill-fated princess, and she's kidnapped in 13 of them.
Not ill-fated or kidnapped in lots of these games.
Peach is kinda accidentally playable in this one.
As opposed to intentionally playable in these games.
Sadly, Peach has never been a playable character again in the main franchise.
Good thing she was made playable in these games.
The princess is still excluded from the action.
Yet included in all the action over here.
Force her back into the damsel role again and again.
And playable over here, again and again.
And Princess Peach's role is essentially that of the ball.
She plays ball with the guys over here. No pun intended.
The two men are tossing her back and forth over the course of the main series.
I've tossed those two around in Smash Bros. Melee, as Peach.
Each trying to keep and take possession of the damsel ball.
Over here, she's not the ball. She's the boss. If you play her well enough. Also, you use a clip from this game for your analogy. Playable characters in Mario Sports Mix. Well, look at that. Princess Peach. You referred to Peach as a ball, only to cite a game where she plays ball with the boys.
Studied extensively.
Isn't it odd how someone's statements sound when you have all the games in front of you? Now let's break down a statement you made about the following games.
Even with newer games that feature 4-player options like the new Super Mario Bros. Wii and Wii U, the princess is still excluded from the action. She's been replaced with another Toad instead, as to allow Nintendo to force her back into the damsel role again and again.
Replaced with Toad. At face value, this seems correct when you compare it to Super Mario Bros. 2. However, did you not notice that Wart was the last boss in Part 2, and Bowser is the last boss here? After digging around, I found this article quoting Masataka Takimoto. In Super Mario Bros. 2, Princess Peach had her own unique moves and animation. In this series, we want all the players to have the same movements and animation as Mario, and Princess Peach isn't suited for that. On top of that, the whole plot for most Mario games is to rescue Princess Peach from Bowser. To my knowledge, she was never intended to be playable in these games, as I have not found anything to indicate otherwise. If that is the case, Peach was not intended to be playable, so how was she replaced? And she wasn't forced into the damsel role, as that is usually her part in the core franchise.
She's been replaced with another Toad instead, force her back into the damsel role.
What did you say you were doing in 2012 when you started this project?
This project requires an enormous amount of research. This is an incredibly ambitious project because of the scope and scale of the research and production involved.
And how much did you raise? What was the point of your Kickstarter?
Studied extensively.
You need to study harder. Did you even spend any of your money?
In 1986, Shigeru Miyamoto doubled down on his damsel in distress formula.
Doubled down on his formula?
Of course, the damsel in distress predates the invention of video games by several thousand years.
Now we move on to Zelda. Let's listen to the short description of Princess Zelda's treatment.
Over the course of more than a dozen games spanning a quarter century, all of the incarnations of Princess Zelda have been kidnapped, cursed, possessed, turned to stone, or otherwise disempowered at some point.
Are you only including the core series? Let's just get to the counter-arguments already.
All of the incarnations of Princess Zelda have been kidnapped, cursed, possessed, turned to stone, or otherwise disempowered at some point.
If any of those things did not happen to Princess Zelda in any of those games I just showed, you are flat out wrong about all of her incarnations being subjected to that treatment. However, you then went on to say this.
Zelda has never been the star in her own adventure. Zelda has never been the star in her own adventure. Zelda has never been the star in her own adventure. Zelda has never been the star in her own adventure.
Yes, she has. How did you manage such a list of Zelda games and leave out the one where she was in fact playable in a lead role? Could be cherry-picked data, or just lazy research.
Studied extensively.
Then you say what I've been alluding to this whole time.
Nor been a true playable character in the core series.
The core series nonsense. You do realize most incarnations of Princess Zelda are in fact a different person. Why do you only include the core series and exclude everything else like Smash Bros. Where she was playable?
However, it must be said that not all damsels are created equal.
I'll remember that line for later as well. For now, let's continue with Zelda.
And Zelda is occasionally given a more active or integral role to play than her counterpart in the Mushroom Kingdom.
This actually sounds like a good thing.
Unlike Peach, Zelda is not completely defined by her role as Ganondorf's perpetual kidnap victim.
Even more good news.
And in a few later games, she even rides the line between damsel and sidekick.
Even more good news.
Once in a while, she might be given the opportunity to have a slightly more active role in facilitating the hero's quest, typically by opening doors, giving hints, power-ups, and other helpful items.
So he took a formula and then improved on it. You've spent a great deal of this video railing on how damsels are treated, and then you point out all the good things that he did to improve the formula. Are you arguing for an improvement on the damsel trope, or arguing to get rid of it altogether?
She is removed from the action, pushed aside, and made helpless at least once in every game she appears in.
You do realize Nintendo has plenty of games where there is no damsel in distress. She seems to have a pretty active role in this game.
It's disappointing that even with her moments of heroism, Zelda is still damseled.
It's disappointing that with all your attempts to educate your audience, you remove these games from your video so you could make that talking point. You have so many points that are inaccurate about Zelda because you exclude this one game. I've learned more about the characters Peach and Zelda from my research than I've learned in your entire video, because I looked at all of their games. Now that we are past the princesses, I want to recap. I'll replay the clips I said I'd remember from earlier. You said this about Peach.
Princess Peach is in many ways the quintessential stock character version of the damsel in distress.
Then you said this later.
However, it must be said that not all damsels are created equal.
You are right. Not all damsels are created equal. Peach's origin started before she was known as Peach.
Princess Toadstool.
Then she went on from being a helpless damsel to being a playable character across several series of games. She even had her own starring role. I don't care how much you dislike that game, it is more than you can say for most damsels. And in the other games, she is on even footing with all the men and has no inherent weakness from being a damsel or a girl. Only in some games where being small can affect the character, and this is not limited to Peach. On top of that, in Smash Bros., there is no start of the game, as it is a Nintendo Universe crossover game.
As well as the Super Smash Bros. Nintendo Universe crossover fighting games.
There is no star in this game. She is their equal in Smash Bros. She plays alongside Mario, who rescues her, and she can fight Bowser instead of being a helpless damsel. How can you claim Peach has been treated so horribly when she has been treated this well? She has been treated better than all the damsels in your whole series combined. Peach is your flagship character for the damsel in distress. Wouldn't your argument for better representation of damsels in games point this out to be a good thing?
Princess Peach is in many ways the quintessential stock character version of the damsel in distress.
I just took your flagship character and turned her into a counter-argument for how at least Nintendo has treated their damsels. On top of that, lots of the arguments I just made for Peach can be applied to Princess Zelda.
However, it must be said that not all damsels are created equal.
You are right. Not all damsels are created equal. Princesses Peach and Zelda are far superior to most, if not all, the damsels you talk about. No company has ever been so kind and fair to their damsels than Nintendo. And instead of encouraging other companies to do the same, all you can do is criticize Shigeru Miyamoto.
Legendary game designer Shigeru Miyamoto joked about how he thought it should be the third installment in his Star Fox franchise instead.
Is it a joke how well the company he's worked for has treated Princess Peach?
When a Japanese company named Nintendo entrusted a young designer named Shigeru Miyamoto with the task of creating a new arcade game for the American market.
Shouldn't more companies entrust men like this so we can have more Princess Peaches in gaming?
In 1986, Shigeru Miyamoto doubled down on his damsel in distress formula.
If doubling down gave us Princess Zelda, and you want damsels to be treated better, couldn't you make the argument we need more developers like him in the industry?
Even though Nintendo certainly didn't invent the damsel in distress, the popularity of their Save the Princess formula essentially set the standard for the industry.
Nintendo's standards for Princess Peach is far higher than most gaming companies. I just turned Peach and Zelda into counter-arguments, at least when it comes to Nintendo.
Studied extensively.
Now let's move on.
Most recently, Double Dragon Neon in 2012 reintroduced new gamers to this regressive crap yet again.
It sounded like you said regressive, but when I read the transcript it says repressive. Then I checked the closed caption which says regressive. I'm not sure if that is a typo, so I'll just go off what it sounded like you said, as I'm pretty sure you said regressive.
Regressive crap, regressive crap, regressive crap.
Regressive. Regressing or tending to regress. Regress. To move backward, go back. People in general decide what is regressive, not you. Society decides what words and trends are acceptable, not one individual. Just as gamers decide what is acceptable in games, not one person sitting back on YouTube criticizing them. Female gamers' opinions matter the most as they are the ones who actually play these games. Yet I see no one's opinion but yours. Someone who used to not be a fan of games.
I'm not a fan of video games. I actually had to learn a lot about video games in the process of making this.
and clarified why.
And also, video games, like, I would love to play video games, but I don't want to go around shooting people and ripping off their heads, and it's just gross.
Who gave a scathing review of Bayonetta sometime later.
But I'm not really here to discuss the overly sexualized adolescent male fantasy that Bayonetta is.
And who to this day has issues with games they themselves don't seem to like. About to replay this monstrosity. The things I do for you people. #cringe. I can only take that to mean you aren't fond of that particular game. I also looked at the credits for Double Dragon Neon, and found there were women that worked on this game and were given special thanks to. Would you tell them to their face a game they were credited in is regressive crap?
Reintroduce new gamers to this regressive crap.
On top of that, you clarify that gamers are reintroduced. We only hear your voice and no one else's. And your disdain for certain types of games has a path that can be chained from years ago to today.
I'm not a fan of video games. I actually had to learn a lot about video games in the process of making this. But I'm not really here to discuss the overly sexualized adolescent male fantasy that Bayonetta is.
Why should we believe this is regressive when your history implies this statement may be biased? Where are the other gamers sharing your opinion?
Reintroduce new gamers.
The only thing regressive are the words coming out of your mouth. For silencing anyone with an opinion is the only form of regression in this whole video.
The pattern of presenting women as fundamentally weak, ineffective, or ultimately incapable
I'm remembering this statement for later.
has larger ramifications beyond the characters themselves and the specific games they inhabit.
Please don't tell me you're about to go down the real world route.
They are an increasingly important and influential part of our larger social and cultural ecosystem.
And here we go.
The reality is, this trope is being used in a real-world context where backward sexist attitudes are already rampant.
Are you talking about the damsel in distress trope? How is a man coming to the aid of a woman in need a bad thing?
It's a sad fact that a large percentage of the world's population still clings to the deeply sexist belief that women as a group need to be sheltered, protected, and taken care of by men.
You speak in a country that allows you freedom of speech, a right that many other countries don't have for women. How does changing video games in this country help women in other countries that don't have a freedom you already have?
But the notion is reinforced and perpetuated when women are continuously portrayed as frail, fragile, and vulnerable creatures.
Always portrayed as frail, fragile, and vulnerable creatures. I need to save this quote as well.
Just to be clear, I'm not saying that all games that use the damsel in distress as a plot device are automatically sexist or have no value.
Despite all the arguments you level against the damsel, you acknowledge they can have value. You spent an entire video criticizing the whole idea. Every incarnation of the trope you had some criticism of. Even in games like Zelda, where you point out all the improvements to the trope, you spent a great deal of the video criticizing it.
All of the incarnations of Princess Zelda have been kidnapped, cursed, possessed, turned to stone, or otherwise disempowered at some point.
How can anyone trust your view on anything when you acknowledge the possible values but do little to praise any games that treat their damsels well? If you believe that, you shouldn't have had anything bad to say about Princess Zelda.
Just to be clear, I'm not saying that all games that use the damsel in distress as a plot device are automatically sexist or have no value.
This is the most biased statement in your whole video. All I've seen is that no game developer can ever develop a damsel that will live to your standards.
And the damsel in distress trope, as a recurring trend, does help to normalize extremely toxic, patronizing, and paternalistic attitudes about women.
I already questioned your ability to provide evidence and interpret data in my first two videos.
Studied extensively.
You shouldn't be making any claims about the real-world effects of games when your evidence is so weak, and your research is lazy.
The good news is that there's nothing stopping developers from evolving their gender representations and making more women heroes in their future games.
I'm going to remember this one as well.
It'd be great to finally see Zelda, Sheik, and Tetra as the protagonists of their own games. And not just mobile DS games, I'm talking full-on console adventures.
Zelda as a protagonist in a full-on console adventure.
Okay, so we've established that the damsel in distress trope is one of the most widely used gendered cliches in the history of video games.
Most widely used gender cliches. Are you cross-referencing this against games that don't feature women as damsels? You aren't presenting a strong case to make that claim without cross-referencing all the games. You referenced 192 games in your entire Damsel series. I'm going to put into perspective how many games exist. I'm going to list home consoles first. I stopped at the Wii U with its launch games because the Xbox One and PlayStation 4 didn't exist when you released your first video. Now I'll take a look at portable game systems. As far as PC games go, after searching for a while, all I was getting were lists without specific numbers. The closest I came to a number was on a wiki page that had 2,720 pages for this category. Since I don't have the time to sort through over 2,000 games, and since wiki pages aren't always 100% accurate, I'll round it down to 2,000. If I had time, I'd exclude any game that came after your Damsel in Distress Part 1, or at the least Part 3. My numbers don't include Flash-based games and tablet games, or anything else I'm leaving out as I don't have time to go through everything in existence that could hold a video game. This is the number I came up with. 27,082. I'm not going to claim this as accurate or deny any mathematical errors I may have made. My point is to show people what actual research might look like. But if you want an even more compelling number, look at the list of every video game ever made. As of the making of this video, one list has it at over 43,000 entries, whereas another has it at over 91,000. But I will stick with the numbers I came to as I put some effort into that. Just an interesting find I had along the way. If I had more time, I'd verify everything was as accurate as possible and exclude games that cross several platforms, as I acknowledge it skews the numbers in my favor somewhat. Then I'd cross-reference all Damsel games against every game ever made to see if it is an issue in the industry as a whole. Then I would sort through all 27,082 games and pick only the ones with female characters and see if the damsel in distress issue is widespread in games with females or only exists in a handful of games with females. This is what real researchers do to prove issues exist. Real research proves claims by examining all the games, not by citing only games that support their claims while ignoring everything else.
Studied extensively.
Even what I present does not meet my standards, because as I said, I don't have the time it takes to do a thorough job. According to math.com, compared to my 27,082 games, you only list 0.70895%. That isn't even 1 full percent of every game I found. Even if I compared your list to only some of the systems from my list, where there is very little risk of games that cross several platforms, my list still dwarfs your list. Now let's think for a moment about how many games have female characters where there are no damsels in distress.
Okay, so we've established that the damsel in distress trope is one of the most widely used gendered cliches in the history of video games.
Did you cross-reference that statement? Now the next few statements are specifically about damsels, but as you can see, not all damsels are necessarily weak or fragile. In order to prove the damsel in distress trope portrays women as weak and frail, you have to cross-reference all the weak damsels against all the strong damsels.
The pattern of presenting women as fundamentally weak, ineffective, or ultimately incapable.
Did you cross-reference that statement?
When women are continuously portrayed as frail, fragile, and vulnerable creatures.
Did you cross-reference that statement?
The good news is that there's nothing stopping developers from evolving their gender representations and making more women heroes in their future games.
There are so many games that already exist with lead female characters, I couldn't name them all off the top of my head, so I found a list. Games in which the main, or major playable character of the game is a female in gender. It lists 1,489 items. That list is quite a bit bigger than yours. So which is the more widespread narrative? Lead female characters or damsels in distress?
Studied extensively.
It would take me some time to go through all 1,489 games to make sure. And since you referenced sequels with reoccurring damsels, would that entitle me to do the same with female characters that play in sequels? Another factor is copies sold. So let's pick one character from your list of damsels.
Princess Peach is in many ways the quintessential stock character version of the damsel in distress.
If she is the quintessential stock damsel, let's see how in modern times she statistically stacks up when you look at copies sold. History is nice, but we need to establish if this is a current issue before we can fix it, as you can't change history. I found a list of top-selling games for the Wii on Wikipedia. For what it's worth, it may or may not be accurate. I'll take 3 games from the core franchise as per your list, and compare them to 3 games from the other 3 big franchises, Mario Kart, Smash Bros., and Mario Party, all released between 2007 and 2010. Within that time frame, you have over 47 million copies sold, where I have over 55 million copies sold. Per copy sold on their big hitters, it's safe to say the statistics show Peach is playable in more games than she is a damsel based on units sold, even though her origins were as a damsel. Now let's see what happens if I compare one of your games to one of each from the other franchises. I'll use your biggest hitter versus all the others. On a per franchise basis, Peach is playable more often than she is a damsel, if you compare it on a 1 game per major franchise basis. If I wanted to throw you a bone, I could just compare new Super Mario Bros. Wii to just Super Smash Bros. Brawl, and you end up ahead with over 28 million versus my 12 million. This shows that statistics can be tweaked in different ways to show different outcomes depending on what parameters you set. Setting parameters can be important if you are trying to prove something. For instance, you could set parameters and use statistics like this to see if damsels in general are more or less of a widespread issue. You can also see trends of whether the trope is becoming more or less prevalent as time goes on. As the industry grows, more games are made. With more games, you have the perception of more damsels. But with statistics, you can see what percentage of the games actually have a damsel. You have to look at the big picture to prove anything, and to prove it is more or less of a trend today than it was back then. The discussion I just went through wasn't to prove Anita right or wrong. The moral of the story is proof comes from real research, not generalized statements without enough evidence to validate such claims.
The pattern of presenting women when women are continuously portrayed widely used gendered cliches.
I don't see one statistic in any of your videos to indicate real research. A real researcher would have compiled lists of statistics, yet I see no signs of any in-depth analysis that can prove or disprove anything on your part.
The pattern of presenting women when women are continuously portrayed widely used gendered cliches.
Patterns of presenting women, continuously portrayed, widely used. I don't see one thing in any of your research to substantiate any of those claims. It is on you to prove your claims to be true at the time you make them. One last reminder on what your Kickstarter was about.
This project requires an enormous amount of research. This is an incredibly ambitious project because of the scope and scale of the research and production involved.
I see no real research. I see no scope and scale. Your project was funded on June 16th, 2012. First video released on March 7th, 2013. And with 158 grand, all we get is just a bunch of lazy research. Where is your proof?
Studied extensively.
This next clip sums up the biggest issue I have with the way Anita defines her research.
Throughout the 80s and 90s, the trope became so prevalent that it would be nearly impossible to mention them all.
Claiming they exist does not prove you actually researched it. You have crossed all over video game history between 3 videos, yet you only referenced 192 games. That is less than 1% of all the games I could find. There are only 2 conclusions to this scenario. You either didn't do the research you claimed you were doing and hide it with generalized statements.
Throughout the 80s and 90s, the trope became so prevalent that it would be nearly impossible to mention them all.
Or your proof doesn't exist. Less than 1% of every game made proves nothing.
Studied extensively.
The amount of counterarguments within your own body of work is mind-numbing. The lack of research in this project has put me in a state of disbelief.
Now, I grew up on Nintendo.
If I were childish, at this point I'd be crying Photoshop.
I've been a fan of the Mario and Zelda franchises for most of my life, and they'll always have a special place in my heart.
Why should we believe that the Mario and Zelda franchises have a special place in your heart when you want sweeping changes to a core element, being the damsel in distress, that help these games to have a special place in the hearts of millions of people around the world? You have 6 videos up, but we are still stuck at damsels in distress. And even though there are 3 videos on that trope, we are still stuck at 1. If this had to go through me, I'd never have given you the okay. But who did it go through? You give special thanks to 8 people in the credits, but don't list what they did, so I can only assume it went through these 2. Anita is responsible since it was uploaded on her channel, but as far as this Jonathan guy goes, this is a big deal, Macintosh. Big Mac. You raised over $158,000 through 6,968 backers that invested in you. People you seem so enthusiastic about in this picture. People who believed in your cause and funded you. People who rushed to your defense when you got massive amounts of harassment for merely announcing this series. Do these backers deserve better than this?
I get a lot of support from people who really like my videos, and they've even been used as educational tools in classrooms. Educational tools.
As far as anyone else watching this video, I leave you with one final question about my review.